The day Mark filed for divorce was not the worst day. That was the day he looked me in the eye, 6 months later, across the mahogany table in the mediation room and smiled. It was a practiced, dismissive smile, the kind that communicated not malice, but total indifference to my existence, like I was a defunct server he'd finally decided to unplug. I had spent 15 years building him, building his confidence, building what he insisted on calling our agency, only to be told my contribution was cute, but ultimately a hindrance to his real vision. We were only signing the papers, and I was agreeing to the settlement, because he'd already spent a year meticulously engineering my obsolescence. He'd convinced me, piece by piece, that my exhaustion was a failure of passion, that the market had moved past my ideas, and that stepping away was the smartest financial decision for everyone, especially for him. The final humiliation wasn't the prenuptial, which had become surprisingly favorable to him after a single, strategic amendment he pushed through when my father was sick and I was distracted. No, the final blow was Mark's smug conviction that I was now an empty vessel. He leaned back in his leather chair, the new one I'd helped him pick out for his post-divorce bachelor pad, and he offered a piece of paternalistic advice as the lawyers shuffled documents. "You're 40, Lindsay," he stated, his voice a low, confident rumble designed to impress the silent paralegal. "You should take the payout and get a nice, easy job. Maybe something part-time. The pace of what we do, the real work of the future, it's not for you anymore." He made a casual gesture with his hand, dismissing a decade and a half of my life's intellectual output. Mark had always understood that the easiest way to defeat a strong woman wasn't to fight her power, but to deny it ever existed, to frame her ambition as a fleeting hobby that had simply run its course. I looked past his smooth, condescending face to the framed photo on the wall behind him, a landscape of Santorini, where I had closed the deal on our biggest client, the one that made him a millionaire overnight. He had taken that photo and hung it here as proof of his own success. I didn't correct him, or argue, or cry, I simply filed the moment away under irreversible debt. I signed the papers with a steady hand, acknowledging the $1.2 million he had magnanimously granted me, a sum designed to be just large enough to keep me silent but too small to be a threat. My silence, however, was not consent, and my composure was not defeat. It was the careful, deliberate conservation of energy. He saw a woman folding her hand, I saw a weapon being primed. Later that week, I started my new life in a small rented office space downtown, 1 block from the agency he now fully owned and 3 blocks from the gleaming corporate tower where his new tech venture, based on my shelved pitch deck, was preparing to launch. When Mark heard about the office from a mutual acquaintance, he actually called me, not to wish me well, but to laugh. "A boutique consultancy, Lindsay? Seriously? You'll be chasing social media campaigns for dentists. Don't worry, darling, I'll send you referrals for the small, annoying stuff." The sound of his genuine, unedited laughter crackled through the phone, a sound that was pure, unadulterated confirmation of his colossal miscalculation. He genuinely believed that the entirety of my value resided within the structure of his company and that, once removed, I would simply decompose. That moment was the precise point of no return. It was the moment I realized the task before me was not merely about divorce or money, it was about the cold, intellectual act of proving a structural error in his worldview. I hung up the phone without a word, already pulling up the encrypted files that contained the original, uncorrupted evidence of who had built what. Mark believed I was starting over, I was merely starting his endgame. His confidence was, statistically speaking, the most potent resource in my arsenal. Mark's success had never been driven by true innovation, it was powered by a kind of boundless, self-affirming arrogance that blinded him to risk and, crucially, to the possibility of being outmaneuvered. He saw me, Lindsay, the woman who managed his diet and his calendar for a decade, as having the tactical ability of a houseplant. This misjudgment was the foundation upon which I built my entire strategy. My boutique consultancy was not a professional surrender, but a holding company, a legal vessel to house the intellectual property he had assumed was abandoned. I spent the next 6 weeks in that quiet, nondescript office, not chasing dentists, but methodically reconstructing the timeline of our agency's inception. I didn't need to steal anything, everything I needed had been created by me and then carelessly discarded by him. I focused first on the Viridian account, the crown jewel of our former agency, the one whose contract he used to justify the high valuation and, consequently, his paltry settlement offer to me. Mark had claimed publicly that he developed the geo-targeting alpha strategy, the key to retaining Viridian. In reality, I had conceptualized, tested, and drafted the original pitch deck for that strategy nearly 3 years ago, only to have Mark dismiss it as over-engineered and too costly for the client at the time. I had saved the entire, time-stamped pitch, the original concept documents, the internal testing results, and the email chain where he explicitly rejected it, not because I was paranoid, but because I am meticulous. I keep records. I now had the irrefutable evidence that his celebrated alpha strategy was merely a recycled, slightly rebranded version of my Phase Zero work. His genius was plagiarism, and I held the receipt. The second, more delicate piece of reconstruction involved the finances surrounding his new venture, the very entity he was crowing about launching. I had always handled the operational side, and while I wasn't an accountant, I understood the flow of money. Months before the divorce was public, Mark had begun paying a strategic communications consultant, a woman named Chloe, a substantial monthly retainer. Mark had tried to wave it off as necessary expense for a competitive marketplace. I now ran a background check on Chloe. Her professional history was thin, and her actual consulting output for the agency was non-existent, yet she had been paid from a specific discretionary fund that bypassed standard HR review. The money trail was clean in a technical sense, but it pointed directly to a systematic misappropriation of company funds just as the business was transitioning into his sole ownership. This wasn't just infidelity, it was a clear violation of his fiduciary duty to the company, and I had the electronic documentation to prove the payments coincided precisely with the beginning of their affair, well before our marriage was officially over. This was not revenge born of rage, it was a detached surgical operation. Every step was vetted by Jessica, my former colleague and now my business partner, a sharp-witted corporate lawyer who understood the difference between emotional spite and legal leverage. Jessica ensured that every action I took, from registering the IP to securing a revolving line of credit against my settlement, was unimpeachably lawful. She constantly reminded me, rage loses in court, Lindsay. Strategy wins. So, I was silent, I was polite, and I was entirely predictable to the outside world, which was exactly what Mark expected. I let him bask in the narrative he had carefully crafted, the innovative, focused male founder finally free of his domestic baggage, poised for his real success. He was so busy accepting accolades for his vision that he never bothered to look back at the trail of evidence I had consciously and strategically left open for him to dismiss. He was already running his race, never realizing I was simply laying the track beneath his feet, right to the finish line I had already decided upon. The key was to let him reach his peak before I applied the pressure. The higher he climbed, the harder he would fall, and the more witnesses there would be to his professional descent. My job was simply to wait for the right time to pull the curtain back. The quiet intensity of those first months was a necessary purgatory, a period of zero visibility where the real work was done. While Mark was giving interviews about his bold, post-divorce future, I was systematically tightening the knots of the legal structure around my new entity, the Phoenix Group. The name was ironic, given his belief that I was a burnt-out relic. Jessica ensured that every operating agreement, every NDA, and every strategic partnership, even the mundane vendor contracts, was built like a fortress. My settlement check was gone, immediately converted into capital for Jessica's retainer, for registering the necessary patents on my early concepts before Mark could realize their value, and for securing the lease on the prime downtown office space I had quietly procured. It was 10 floors above his current headquarters, overlooking the entire business district. I wasn't ready to occupy it, but the lease had to be secured now, a silent declaration of my future territory. My public profile remained deceptively low. I accepted a few genuine, small-scale contracts, the kind of social media campaigns for dentists he had scoffed at, but only as a means of generating a clean, verifiable income stream and establishing a legitimate, active portfolio. These were distractions, smokescreens designed to reinforce the narrative that I was merely occupying myself with harmless, low-stakes work. The reality was that every invoice, every successful campaign, was building the new, unimpeachable professional reputation, one entirely separate from Mark's reflected glory. I knew that when the hammer finally dropped, his lawyers would attempt to discredit my current work, suggesting I was merely using his connections or funds. I was creating proof that I could, and did, generate my own success. The most critical step in this setup phase was establishing contact with the executive leadership at Veridian, the client he was now claiming as entirely his own. I didn't approach them directly with threats or accusations, that would have been amateurish and volatile. Instead, I used my legitimate new company, the Phoenix Group, to pitch a subtle, entirely unrelated digital audit to Veridian's chief marketing officer, a pragmatic woman named Helen I had worked closely with years ago. I pitched it as a market preparedness assessment, a neutral, low-cost stress test of their current agency relationship. The proposal was professional, dense with data, and strategically neutral. I didn't mention Mark or our divorce, I simply offered a superior, cold analysis of their current market saturation, an analysis I knew would reveal subtle but undeniable underperformance in the very areas where my original geo-targeting alpha strategy was meant to excel. Helen took the bait, signing a small, pilot contract. This gave me direct, lawful access to Veridian's current performance metrics, which confirmed my suspicion. Mark's implementation of my strategy was sloppy, rushed, and already showing significant decay. He had the framework but lacked the meticulous execution required to sustain it. He was coasting on my foundational work. This contract was my key, not to steal the client yet, but to gain the intelligence needed to execute the final maneuver. It allowed me to establish a new, professional trust with Helen, one built on my present competence, not our shared past. I was establishing myself as the solution to problems Mark didn't even know he was creating. My objective was simple: make Mark's continued involvement look like the clear, measurable business risk it was. The calm was deceptive. Beneath the surface, the pieces were sliding into their final, predetermined positions, and Mark remained utterly unaware, enjoying his moment of perceived triumph, certain that the woman he dismissed was happily busy with the equivalent of corporate needlepoint. His professional blindness was truly magnificent. The analysis for Veridian's CMO, Helen, was precisely what I knew it would be: irrefutable proof of Mark's strategic drift. I presented the data without emotion, focusing purely on the annualized revenue impact of the campaign holes I had identified. My report showed a quantifiable erosion of market share in a specific, high-value demographic, the exact demographic my original, rejected pitch had targeted. I never once said, "Mark is failing." I simply showed Helen the numbers, allowed her team to verify the alarming decay, and then, only then, did I suggest a solution. It wasn't a pitch to replace Mark, it was a proposal for a high-velocity, specialized patch campaign to mitigate the bleeding, a campaign that would, conveniently, allow me to implement the missing components of the geo-targeting alpha strategy he had neglected. It was the purest form of strategic control. I was getting paid to fix his mistakes, and in doing so, I was planting myself firmly within his most valuable account, turning his blind spot into my beachhead. Mark, meanwhile, was entirely occupied by the grand launch of his new company. He'd spent a disproportionate amount of capital on a massive PR campaign, securing downtown billboards and full-page advertisements that featured his confident, tailored image alongside bombastic claims about disrupting the market. He was addicted to the spectacle, mistaking noise for success. The irony was exquisite: the core technological framework he was promoting was based on my discarded patent draft, and every single public-facing claim was a recycled line from my original marketing proposal for the agency, a proposal he'd once deemed too subtle. He was so busy selling the idea of himself as a genius that he failed to notice the foundational cracks in the infrastructure he was building. His focus on outward projection was my greatest asset. He was looking up at the lights, never down at his footing. My personal life became as structured and cold as my professional moves. I kept my distance from shared friends, not out of bitterness, but to starve the rumor mill and avoid giving Mark any insight into my current mindset. I adopted a uniform of tailored suits and a schedule so rigid it left no room for vulnerability. I was, to the world, simply a successful, quiet businesswoman finding her footing after a difficult personal event. This deliberate lack of drama was key. I wanted Mark to remain confident that he had broken me of any desire for confrontation. I wanted him to believe my silence meant surrender, not calculated preparation. The final piece of the setup involved the billboard itself, though not the one he was currently celebrating. I used the capital from my successful small contracts and the Viridian pilot campaign to quietly reserve a massive, premium digital space in the heart of the central business district, the busiest intersection, directly opposite his new headquarters. I had Jessica draw up an airtight, 6-month contract for the space, set to activate exactly 1 week after Mark's grand launch event. I also had her initiate the filing of a preliminary legal motion, one that was purely procedural and related to the original agency's intellectual property filings, an innocent-looking document, designed to raise no flags. The motion was an administrative request for time-stamped archival data, the very data that would contain the emails proving Mark's knowledge and rejection of my original geo-targeting alpha strategy. The filing was so dry and technical, filed under a minor docket, that his overwhelmed legal team missed it entirely, or simply dismissed it as a post-divorce administrative headache. They assumed I was just crossing T's and dotting I's. They were looking for a fight, I was executing a plan. The stage was set, the evidence was secured, and the timer was counting down to the public, decisive moment of strategic reversal. There would be no fanfare from me, only the quiet, logical unfolding of consequences. The day of Mark's grand launch was precisely the kind of self-congratulatory circus I had anticipated. The media coverage was breathless, focusing exclusively on his visionary pivot and the aggressive capital raise for his new entity. He hosted a lavish rooftop party, visible from my newly secured, empty office 10 floors above him. I didn't attend, of course. I watched the live-streamed highlights on my tablet from my modest rented space, analyzing the trajectory of the parabolic curve he was tracing. The higher the spectacle, the sharper the eventual drop. He was making every boast, every bold promise, promises I knew, based on my intellectual property, his team lacked the structural capacity to deliver. His arrogance, fueled by champagne and public validation, was reaching critical mass. The tension, for me, was not emotional but tactical. It resided entirely in the timing of my next move. I had established the Phoenix Group as the fixer for Viridian. Now, I began escalating the complexity of my work for them, moving from simply mitigating Mark's failures to actively implementing the superior elements of my original geo-targeting alpha strategy. This required increased access to Viridian's confidential data and a deeper, more collaborative relationship with Helen, the CMO. During our strategy meetings, I never once disparaged Mark or his agency. I spoke only in terms of data efficiency, competitive benchmarks, and opportunity cost. We need to maximize this channel, Helen, I would say, pointing to a graph that showed a sharp dip coinciding with Mark's recent agency transition. The current allocation is simply not optimized for modern behavioral targeting. We can't afford this lag. This disciplined neutrality was powerful. It prevented Mark from accusing me of personal vendetta. I was operating as a clean, efficient business asset, whereas Mark's agency was beginning to show signs of internal strain. His sudden, aggressive expansion into the new tech venture was diverting resources and his best talent, most of whom were my former hires, leaving the foundational agency understaffed and reactive. He was running 2 empires on the budget of one, and the quality of the primary service, the one Viridian relied on, was visibly degrading. Helen and her team didn't need me to tell them Mark was distracted. My performance reports spoke for themselves, highlighting the measurable gap between the results I was generating and the decline in the results from his primary agency. The quiet legal motion I filed weeks ago, the administrative request for time-stamped archival data, began to yield results. His legal team, assuming it was a routine discovery request, released a massive data dump, buried within which were the crucial pieces of evidence, the email thread where Mark categorically rejected the geo-targeting alpha strategy as financially unviable and the final, signed contract revisions granting him specific IP rights based on a valuation that deliberately excluded the value of that very concept. The evidence was now physically in my possession, secured by Jessica, and legally defensible. I wasn't relying on a gotcha moment, I was relying on irrefutable, time-stamped corporate history. I was building a civil case not just for fraud or misappropriation, but for intentional undervaluation during the divorce proceedings, a much more financially and reputationally damaging angle. Mark was still celebrating his launch, oblivious that the very data he authorized to be released was the blueprint for his professional implosion. The clock was ticking down to the moment the public would see the professional, meticulous reality behind his charismatic facade. The billboard was reserved, the evidence was compiled, the client was now firmly in my orbit. Everything was in place. The final component of the tension buildup was Mark's reaction to the small, surgical losses I was inflicting. He still hadn't grasped the overall pattern, but the small annoyances were starting to mount. He received a sharp email from Veridian's CMO, Helen, regarding the underperformance in the specific demographic I was now targeting for her. The email didn't name me, but it praised the proactive, external consultancy that had helped identify the leakage. Mark's initial reaction was pure dismissal. He ordered his team to produce a frantic, internal rebuttal report, blaming the market and external factors. He didn't connect the dots because the idea of me, Lindsay, being the external consultancy was simply too preposterous for his ego to process. He saw only a competitor, he didn't see his ex-wife meticulously dismantling his foundation. I also strategically leaked a small, almost undetectable piece of information regarding the funding for his new venture to a low-tier industry blog, a subtle query about the true source of the seed capital. The query was framed as a genuine curiosity about market trends, not an accusation. It hinted that a significant portion of his initial war chest came not from savvy investors, but from the leveraged buyout of the original agency, which relied heavily on the valuation of the Veridian account. This didn't cause a crisis, but it created chatter. It introduced a subtle, professional skepticism into the industry narrative that had previously been pure worship. Investors and competitors started asking quiet questions, forcing Mark to spend precious time and energy on damage control, drawing his focus even further away from the structural integrity of his primary agency. He was fighting ghosts, never realizing I was the one pulling the strings behind the curtain. The financial pressure was intensifying. Mark's new venture was a burn rate machine, fueled by the expectation of immediate, massive returns based on my rejected pitch concepts. He needed the Veridian cash flow to remain absolutely pristine to keep the institutional investors calm. Jessica, my partner, now filed a slightly more aggressive legal motion, still administrative, still dry, but this time requesting an independent forensic audit of the original agency's books prior to the settlement date, citing a minor discrepancy in the reporting of consultancy fees. This motion was the first one that truly bothered Mark's legal team. They pushed back, demanding clarification, but Jessica, cool and precise, cited the specific financial codes related to fiduciary responsibility, using language that suggested the issue was a potential tax complication rather than a marital dispute. By framing the inquiry as a regulatory matter, she elevated its importance and made it harder for them to simply dismiss. The consultancy fees in question, of course, were the funds paid to Chloe, the mistress. The audit request was not about exposing the affair, it was about exposing the fraud. If the independent audit found those payments lacked verifiable, professional deliverables, it would prove a misuse of company capital just before the buyout, a clear breach of fiduciary duty and grounds to invalidate the settlement's valuation. Mark's lawyers, under pressure, tried to bury the request in delays, but the legal clock was now ticking publicly. It was during this heightened, yet still controlled, period of escalation that I finalized the creative for the downtown billboard. The design was the antithesis of Mark's loud, self-aggrandizing ads. It was simple, black and white, and featured only a single, arresting image, the logo of the Phoenix Group, beneath which was a single, three-word tagline, "We fix foundational errors." There was no mention of me, no mention of Mark, just the cold, confident assertion of competence. The location, directly facing Mark's headquarters, was a deliberate, Architectural taunt. The activation date was confirmed for early the following Monday morning, 2 days before the judge was set to rule on our motion for the independent forensic audit. The psychological timing was paramount. The public statement of my return would precede the private, legal knife twist, ensuring maximum emotional impact and professional disruption. The setup was complete. It was time for the world, and Mark, to stop laughing. Monday morning dawned, crisp and clear, exactly the kind of atmospheric precision I required for the turning point. I didn't go to my new office, I drove downtown and parked 3 blocks away, choosing a coffee shop with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a direct, unobstructed view of the massive digital screen opposite Mark's glittering glass tower. At exactly 7 a.m., the rotation shifted. Mark's aggressive, smiling face, his billboard ad for the new tech venture, vanished, replaced by a sudden, severe block of black and white. It was quiet, arresting, and instantly dominant in its sheer contrast to the visual noise of the city. There was no branding beyond the stylized The Phoenix Group logo, only the stark, cold assertion, "We fix foundational errors." I watched, not the billboard, but the subtle shift in the movement of the financial workers exiting the subway and heading into Mark's building. They paused. They read it. The message was subtle enough to be ignored by a casual tourist but brutally specific to anyone in the digital marketing and tech finance sectors. It wasn't a product ad, it was a statement of intellectual superiority. A guarantee of surgical precision. And it was located on the only premium advertising space he had failed to secure. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the cool, controlled wave of satisfaction, knowing that the intellectual fuse had just been lit. The first call came exactly 12 minutes later. It wasn't Mark, it was Jessica. Her voice, usually calm, held a note of contained excitement. "He's seen it, Lindsay. The managing partner at his firm is already on the phone. They're trying to figure out if it's a competitor or a veiled threat. They can't figure out who the Phoenix Group is or what foundational errors refers to, but they know exactly where that spot is, and they know the rental price. It's rattling them." I instructed her to remain completely silent. The Phoenix Group had no public-facing website yet, no listed services, just a registered corporate identity and that single, powerful visual assertion. Ambiguity was the true weapon. Let them waste time and energy analyzing the threat, convinced it had to be a billion-dollar rival they hadn't foreseen. Mark, predictably, reacted with explosive anger rather than strategic inquiry. He viewed the billboard as a personal affront, a direct, public challenge to the narrative he was so carefully cultivating. He made the amateur mistake of allowing his ego to drive his response. Later that morning, I received a scathing email from him, bypassing the legal teams entirely. It was riddled with typographical errors, a clear sign of his diminished composure. He accused me of unprofessionalism, of harassment, and of petty, post-divorce vindictiveness. "You think this pathetic little stunt helps you, Lindsay? You're a joke. You're trying to compete with me with a slogan? Go back to your boutique and stop making a spectacle of yourself." I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email, without commentary, to Jessica. Her legal response was instantaneous and surgical, a single, crisp email to Mark's managing partner, copying his entire legal team. It simply stated that his email constituted an interference with my legitimate business operations, and reminded them that the impending hearing for the independent forensic audit was tomorrow morning. The implicit message was clear: my business, the Phoenix Group, was very real, very capitalized, and its next professional engagement was with his company's financials. The shift was complete. The public challenge of the billboard had seamlessly transitioned into the private, legal challenge of the audit. Mark had been tricked into exposing his emotional instability just before I was about to expose his financial instability. The climax had arrived, cold and deliberate. The morning of the audit hearing arrived, and I appeared exactly as I had planned, cool, polished, and accompanied by Jessica, whose demeanor was the picture of detached corporate focus. We sat quietly, observing Mark, who arrived late, his face strained, still visibly agitated by the billboard. He was operating under a critical delusion. He believed this was still about me, about the divorce settlement. He hadn't realized that the scope had widened, that the narrative had been fundamentally altered from a personal dispute to a professional liability. Jessica opened our argument not by mentioning infidelity or personal betrayal, but by presenting the meticulously compiled evidence of the consultancy fee discrepancy. She presented the paper trail proving $300,000 had been transferred from the agency's operating fund to Chloe, the consultant, in the months leading up to the settlement. She then introduced the next piece of evidence, Chloe's own public LinkedIn profile, showing a professional history entirely unrelated to the high-level communications consulting Mark had paid her for. Jessica's voice was even, clinical. The petitioner, Mr. Mark, antagonist's last name, represented the agency's financials to be sound for the purposes of the buyout. However, these documents suggest a systematic misappropriation of corporate resources for non-essential, non-deliverable services, effectively diminishing the reported value of the agency's assets just prior to the final valuation. Mark's lawyer, having been preoccupied with the Billboard and the public relations disaster of the launch, was blindsided by the financial depth of the attack. He tried to dismiss the payments as standard business development expenses, but Jessica immediately countered, introducing the final, devastating piece of evidence, the very emails his own firm had produced through the routine administrative discovery process, the time-stamped proof of Mark rejecting the geo-targeting alpha strategy. She connected the dots with chilling precision. The agency's valuation was derived primarily from the future profitability of the Viridian account, using the alpha strategy. Yet, these documents show the petitioner formally dismissed that strategy as financially unviable 3 years ago, only to recycle it after the divorce while simultaneously diverting capital to a personal associate. This pattern suggests not financial incompetence, Your Honor, but a calculated effort to suppress the agency's true intellectual property value during the settlement and divert funds for private use. The room went silent. The judge, who had initially viewed the matter as a standard, contentious divorce cleanup, now looked genuinely concerned. Mark's face, which had been tight with anger, slackened into a horrified realization. He wasn't just being exposed, he was being framed by his own paper trail, a trail I had built, step by logical step, with his full, arrogant cooperation. The core of the conflict had shifted from is Lindsay a bitter ex-wife? To did Mark commit a measurable financial fraud? The question required an answer that only a full, independent audit could provide. The judge granted the motion, ordering a comprehensive forensic audit of the agency's accounts, effectively freezing the transfer of any further major assets until the true valuation could be determined. This was the decisive turn. The audit didn't just expose the misuse of funds for Chloe, it immediately created instability for his new venture, as the promised capital relied on the now disputed valuation of the old agency. Mark, who lived for his reputation, now had the shadow of a financial investigation cast over his professional genius. He tried to speak, sputtering a defense about personal matters, but the judge cut him off, making it clear this was now a matter of corporate fiduciary responsibility. I watched Mark's collapse from a confident CEO to a desperate, cornered man, and it was entirely unspectacular, just the quiet, logical result of mathematics and law. He laughed at my small start. Now, his end was starting with a single, cold signature from a judge. The immediate fallout from the court-ordered forensic audit was precisely the controlled chaos I had engineered. Mark's world, built entirely on projected success and controlled narratives, was instantly destabilized by the single phrase, financial investigation. The news didn't hit the major papers immediately, but the chatter among venture capitalists and his institutional investors was deafening. Capital is timid, and the mere mention of a frozen asset transfer and an audit tied to fiduciary breach was enough to send a ripple of panic through his funding rounds. The expected second tranche of investment for his new venture was immediately placed on hold, pending the audit's findings. The high-risk, high-reward strategy he had staked everything on was now suspended in a legal limbo, starving his new company of the cash it needed to maintain the aggressive, high-profile trajectory he had promised. I didn't need to do any more public relations, the market did the work for me. The bold confidence of his new company's launch, still being touted on his billboard just blocks away, now looked like reckless bravado in the face of sudden financial scrutiny. The narrative shifted from visionary CEO to CEO under investigation. This reputational erosion was the first, and most significant, consequence. For Mark, the loss of face was worse than the loss of money. His public image was his currency, and I had effectively devalued it. Meanwhile, my relationship with Viridian's CMO, Helen, deepened. The audit made Mark unreliable, forcing her to rely on the one consistent, competent source of data and execution, the Phoenix Group. I presented Helen with the next phase of my campaign, one that required pulling a significant portion of the budget from Mark's underperforming agency. I presented the move not as a personal favor, but as a risk mitigation strategy essential for their quarterly targets. "We need to secure this revenue," I told her, my tone entirely pragmatic. "With the current legal distractions at their end, we simply cannot afford the operational risk." Helen, a seasoned professional who reported to a board, understood the clear logic: reliable results trumped unreliable history. She signed the transfer documents without hesitation, shifting a seven-figure portion of the Viridian account directly into the Phoenix Group's ledger. This move was the quiet, financial gut punch. It simultaneously validated my value and stripped Mark of the asset that formed the very basis of his disputed valuation. The loss of that major contract meant his original agency was functionally hollowed out, making his defense against the audit exponentially more difficult. I was not just reclaiming justice, I was reclaiming the market share that was rightfully mine, brick by cold, logical brick. Mark was spiraling, caught in a self-inflicted storm of his own making. The loss of the substantial Viridian budget segment was a public-facing injury that he couldn't hide from his staff or his remaining clients. His frantic attempts to explain the temporary reallocation were met with polite skepticism. He tried to contact me directly again, but this time, the tone was one of frantic negotiation, not arrogant dismissal. He offered to reopen the settlement discussion, dangling an extra $1 million if I would simply withdraw the motion for the audit and stop interfering with his client base. This was a clear admission of guilt, a panicked attempt to buy back control. I never responded to him personally. Instead, I had Jessica issue a one-sentence legal reply: "All communication must proceed through established legal channels and the court-mandated discovery process." My silence amplified the severity of the situation far more than any angry retort could have. It signaled that this was no longer a personal spat, it was a matter of irreversible corporate and legal procedure. The forensic audit commenced, and its findings were devastatingly swift and cold. Within 3 weeks, the auditor's preliminary report confirmed the core of my accusation: the payments to Chloe lacked professional justification, constituting a clear misuse of corporate funds while Mark was still bound by fiduciary duty to the shared asset. Furthermore, the report formally noted the intellectual property discrepancy, the fact that the geo-targeting alpha strategy that formed the basis of the agency's valuation was demonstrably rejected and then covertly resurrected, indicating that the agency's value had indeed been misrepresented during the settlement calculation. The legal hammer fell immediately. Jessica filed a motion for summary judgment based on the auditor's findings, arguing that Mark's initial valuation of the agency was fraudulently low and that the settlement was therefore null and void. She requested that the court immediately grant me a controlling interest in the original agency's assets and full ownership of the intellectual property pertaining to the strategy he had stolen and mishandled. The fallout was absolute. With the capital freeze, the loss of Viridian revenue, and the audit's findings, his institutional investors pulled their final commitments from the new venture. The company Mark had launched with such fanfare collapsed quietly, starved of cash and credibility. He was left with a shell of an old agency, the stain of illegal fraud finding, and a spectacular failure that was now the primary topic of industry gossip. His billboard, the symbol of his soaring ambition, still stood, but now it served only as a stark contrast to the quiet, factual reality of the forensic report. His final act of control, leaving me with nothing but a paltry check, had resulted in him losing everything that mattered to him: his reputation, his control, and his future. The stage was set for the final, cold reckoning. The courtroom finale was mercifully brief, a clean excision of a corrupted structure. Mark's lawyers, recognizing the futility of fighting the forensic evidence, advised him to settle immediately, before the judge issued a final ruling that could invite regulatory scrutiny. The terms of the settlement were dictated entirely by me, through Jessica, with the cold precision of a business transaction. There were no emotional demands, no dramatic stipulations, only the logical restoration of order. The final decree voided the original divorce settlement valuation. In exchange for withdrawing the motion for fraud, I took a 75% controlling equity stake in the original marketing agency, effectively making me his primary employer and the majority shareholder of the asset he thought he had stolen. I did not want to manage the old agency, I wanted control over its assets, its client list, and its intellectual property, which now legally reverted to the Phoenix Group. The remaining 25%, left to Mark, was purely functional, enough to satisfy the legal requirements of an asset division, but entirely stripped of all meaningful control. The man who had laughed at me for being obsolete was now a minority, non-voting partner in the company I had built, subject to my professional decisions. The intellectual property was the crucial element. The strategy he had recycled and the subsequent advancements developed during the audit period were legally transferred to the Phoenix Group. This secured my position with Veridian. With the legal ambiguity removed and the IP officially mine, Helen, the CMO, finalized the transfer of the entire Veridian account to my firm. The client was not stolen, it was transferred through an impeccable chain of legal and business necessity, leaving Mark with precisely zero of the revenue he had used to justify his buyout. I used my new, legitimate position as the majority shareholder to dissolve his board and install an interim manager, a sharp, quiet professional who reported solely to me. I made no dramatic public announcement, the change was communicated internally through a cold, concise memo, signed by Lindsay, controlling shareholder. It was the ultimate reversal of power, enacted through paper, not shouting. Mark, now financially neutered and reputationally crippled, watched his remaining staff, the good ones, the ones I had originally hired, migrate to my now booming Phoenix Group. My victory was not the satisfaction of his pain, it was the quiet, absolute clarity of knowing I had used my intellect to reclaim every asset and every piece of power he had tried to take. His defeat was simply a byproduct of my strategic success. The ultimate sign of restored order was not the final legal decree, but the routine of the following Monday. I was now operating out of the penthouse office I had quietly leased months prior, 10 floors above Mark's shrunken, desperate operation. The space was minimalist, efficient, and afforded a spectacular view of the entire central business district, including the large digital billboard at the busiest intersection. I finally had a team, the best talent from the old agency, those who valued competence over charisma, and they were focused, productive, and entirely loyal to the results we were generating. The Phoenix Group, no longer a shell, was thriving, its value anchored by the fully secured Veridian account and the specialized intellectual property. I received a brief, impersonal final update from Jessica that morning. Mark had officially vacated the old agency's executive floor, retreating to a smaller, sublet space. He hadn't fought the final terms. He was professionally exhausted and financially compromised, his arrogance having been replaced by a quiet, toxic mix of shock and rage. His last public act was to try and take his name off the original agency's door, a final, futile gesture of dignity. I immediately issued a counter order, insisting his name remain prominently displayed, now as a bitter, symbolic reminder of the entity he was no longer allowed to control. The true ending, however, was silent and entirely personal. Late that afternoon, I was in a strategy meeting when I glanced out the window, down at the constant, rhythmic churn of the city below. I saw Mark, standing alone on the sidewalk, looking up. He wasn't looking at his failed venture's address, he was looking directly across the street, at the colossal digital screen that featured my company's advertisement. The timing was perfect. As I watched, the rotation shifted, and the stark, black and white message of the Phoenix Group was illuminated, the slogan "We fix foundational errors" blazing across the skyline. He stood there for a long moment, a solitary figure in an expensive, ill-fitting suit, finally understanding the totality of the reversal. The woman he had discarded as a distraction, whose career he had deemed finished, was now literally dominating his field of vision, the cold assertion of her competence mocking his collapse. He hadn't just lost a divorce, he had lost the professional war I had fought with composure and intellect, using his own paper trail as my weapon. He had laughed when I started over. Now, I simply looked down from my superior vantage point and let the cold, clean light of my success cast a long shadow over his defeat. I turned away from the window and back to my work, the matter closed. There was no forgiveness, no further drama, just the absolute, unyielding order of a meticulously executed plan.